I used to think the worst thing my parents could do was disapprove. But now I know the worst thing they can do is pretend that their control is love. The first time my mom spilled red wine on James, I thought it was just clumsy. She barely flinched, just handed him a napkin and smiled like nothing happened. James ever. The gentleman laughed it off and said, "Good thing this isn't my interview shirt," and I smiled too, because back then I was still trying to believe it was all a misunderstanding, that maybe they just needed time. But the second time, 2 weeks later, same dinner table, same shirt color, same stain, no way that was an accident. I remember watching the wine soak into his sleeve like it was in slow motion. James froze. I froze. And my mom, she barely looked up from her salad, just muttered, "Some stains never come out," and passed him a napkin again. Same smile, colder eyes. That was the first crack, and once you see the crack, you can't unsee the whole damn wall falling. James and I had only been dating a few months, but it felt real in that effortless, warm kind of way. We met during that freak storm last April when I got stranded downtown. My Uber canceled and I ducked into a tiny used bookstore to get out of the rain, soaked, shivering, completely underdressed for the weather. He worked there. He made a dumb joke about my dripping hair short-circuiting the sci-fi section. I laughed. He offered me tea from the staff kettle in the back. We ended up talking for over an hour, books, cartoons, childhood snacks. By the time I left with his umbrella in my hand, I already had his number saved. He didn't come from money, and that was his biggest crime in my parents' eyes. My dad runs a small investment firm. My mom's from an old money family that still throws charity galas where people compete over who brings the most discreet champagne. I went to private school art college and spent half my life being told to sit up straight and present. Well, James, he grew up with a single mom who worked night shifts as a nurse's aide, put himself through community college, runs the bookstore now even though it barely breaks even because he loves it and believes in it. And I admired that so much, his quiet strength, his stubborn goodness. But to my parents, that translated to no pedigree, no future, no value. It started small. Questions that weren't really questions. Does he have a 5-year plan? Have you talked about financial stability? And then the not-so-subtle jabs? You're still young, honey. You don't have to settle. Then came the helpful articles about how relationships in your 20s rarely last. And then I found the dating profiles. 3 of them on apps I'd never used, bios I didn't write, but photos taken directly from my Instagram. When I confronted my mom, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "I'm just keeping your options open." Options like love is a buffet and James. He was the side dish they hoped I'd eventually walk past. I remember slamming my hand on the counter, not because of the profiles though, that was awful, but because she genuinely believed she was helping James, never complained, never raised his voice. But I saw it in the way his shoulders slumped a little more each time we came back from dinner at my parents'. How quiet he got when my dad started dropping casual facts about the divorce rates of couples from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and still, James tried. He held my hand under the table. He helped me with my final project for school, even when he was dead tired. He left me sticky notes on my laptop reminding me to breathe. But one night after another long and awkward dinner, James finally said something that broke me. He looked at me and whispered, "I don't think your parents will ever see me as good enough for you," and I didn't have an answer because I was starting to wonder if he was right. The worst part, it wasn't just that they didn't like him, it was that they were trying to erase him. And then came the night I overheard it all. I was helping my dad set up his new MacBook because apparently being under 30 makes me Apple support. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and stopped in my tracks. They didn't hear me, but I heard them. "That boy is just using her," my dad said. "He probably sees her as his meal ticket. We need to intervene before this goes too far," my mom replied. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered, like the illusion I had that they'd ever really trusted me to make my own choices. They rushed in, saw the tears, and instead of apologizing, my dad doubled down. He said I was being naive, that I was throwing away my future, that I needed someone from our circle. I lost it. Told them James was the best thing that ever happened to me, that he had more integrity in one breath than they had in a decade of dinner parties. My mom blinked at me like I'd slapped her. My dad called me ungrateful. I walked out that night with my hands shaking and my heart in pieces. But I also walked out with something else. A decision I wasn't going to let them choose for me anymore. How do you choose between survival and love? There's this weird moment that happens right after everything blows up. It's not anger, it's not even grief, it's this quiet numbness. Like your brain pulls a curtain shut and goes, okay, we'll deal with this later. That was me sitting in the front seat of my car in my parents' driveway, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. I didn't even turn the engine on for 15 minutes. I just sat there, tears pooling in my lap, listening to the echo of my dad's words. You break up with James or we stop paying your tuition. Just like that, no hesitation, no compassion, just a line in the sand drawn with money, and it wasn't just tuition, it was everything. The phone I was using on their family plan, my health insurance through their employer policy, my final semester, prepaid until they called the school and reversed the payment 2 days later. They didn't just cut me off. They erased me from their version of the future. James was the one who found me crying in my apartment that night. My lease still 3 weeks from ending, surrounded by half-packed boxes and unopened bills. I told him everything, the ultimatum, the threats, the fact that they'd rather see me alone and dependent than loved and struggling. He just sat there, quiet still. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you want me to step back? Because if that would help you finish school, I understand. That broke me more than anything. They had offered him money to leave me, and now he was offering to do it for free if that's what I needed. I think I cried for an hour straight. Not from sadness, but from love, from realizing I had someone who cared about my future more than my own parents did. I told him no. Absolutely not. I wasn't going to sacrifice the one thing in my life that felt real just to stay on someone else's payroll. But the reality hit hard. My savings were laughable, enough for maybe half a semester if I lived on instant noodles and caffeine. My freelance gigs were inconsistent, and every other day I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Still, I started packing. James offered to let me move in early, even though we were planning to do it next month. His place was tiny, like you can hear the toilet flush from the kitchen tiny, but it was warm, safe hours. That first night I stayed there, I slept on a pile of folded blankets because we hadn't figured out where to fit my things yet. There were 2 mugs, 1 frying pan, and a drawer full of mismatched socks. But when I woke up the next morning to the smell of coffee and James humming off-key in the shower, I knew I'd made the right call. Even if it didn't feel like it all the time, reality came crashing in fast, rent was due, health insurance gone, my laptop charger broke, and I had to choose between replacing it or buying groceries. I emailed the financial aid office 3 times before someone finally got back to me. Emergency support, maybe, but there were forms, deadlines, proof of income. I filled out every line like my life depended on it, because it kind of did. Meanwhile, my parents went silent, except for the occasional text from my mom saying things like, "We're worried about your behavior," or "You're pushing everyone away." And my favorite, "We raised you better than this." Better than what? Choosing love over control, respect over reputation. My sister Rose kept me updated in secret. Told me my mom cried a lot that they were telling the extended family I was taking time to figure things out. Translation, I was embarrassing them. The hardest part wasn't the bills, it wasn't the stress or the fatigue or the empty fridge. It was the loneliness, not because I didn't have James, but because I didn't have them. Even after everything they did, some part of me still wanted their approval, still craved their voices telling me I was doing okay. But all I got was silence or guilt. Some nights I stared at my phone wondering if I should just apologize, say I'd been rash, say I'd made a mistake, and then I'd remember the envelope, the 10,000 check, the way my dad slid it across the table, like James was a bad investment they were trying to cash out. That image kept me anchored. That was the line I couldn't cross again. And still, there were moments I doubted everything. Moments I looked at the ramen packet in my hands and wondered if love was really enough. But every time I walked into that tiny apartment, every time James looked up and smiled like I was the best part of his day, I remembered something more powerful than fear. I was finally living a life I chose, even if I had no idea how I was going to afford it. Sometimes it takes losing everything to finally see what matters. You'd think rock bottom would be dramatic, like crashing into the earth at full speed, leaving a crater behind. But for me, it was quieter. It looked like sitting on the floor of James's bathroom, eating peanut butter from a spoon because we didn't have clean bowls left and I was too tired to wash any. I'd just come home from a double shift at the cafe, blisters on my heels, 3 missed calls from a client, and a rejection email from a scholarship I was banking on. James had made me a little dinner plate, scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast, and half a banana. But when I opened the fridge and saw how empty it was, I couldn't eat it. I cried instead, not sobs, just quiet tears that wouldn't stop. He found me an hour later sitting on the tile floor holding the peanut butter jar like it was a trophy for surviving the day. He didn't say anything, just sat beside me and rested his head on my shoulder. And that was the moment I realized something important. This was love, not the glossy kind you post about online, the kind that sits beside you on a dirty bathroom floor and doesn't ask for anything except to be let in. We were exhausted, but we were real. I started tracking every dollar, cut out every luxury. I even stopped using shampoo brands I liked. I emailed 3 more departments at school about aid and finally landed a last-minute emergency grant. Not enough to cover everything, but enough to breathe. I picked up more freelance work. Some of it was soul-sucking, editing wedding videos for couples I'd never meet, but it helped. James, meanwhile, was doing odd jobs for small businesses. Social media, bookkeeping, inventory, reorgs. He said helping a vegan candle store alphabetize their labels wasn't how he imagined his life going, but hey, it paid. The worst part, we barely saw each other. We'd collapse into bed at 1 a.m., whisper a few words, then pass out, but he always left me these little notes, taped to my laptop, stuck to the fridge, hidden in my books. One said, "You're braver than you think." Another, "Ramen night again, but I'll try to make it fancy." We started calling it fancy ramen. If we added an egg or chopped scallions, it was our way of surviving. Then came the day I ran into my mom. Target of all places, I was buying discount shampoo and off-brand cold meds because I'd caught a cold during finals week and didn't even have enough to cover name-brand Tylenol. She looked perfect, blow-dried hair, tailored coat, shopping cart full of organic groceries. I looked like a sick raccoon in James's hoodie. She blinked when she saw me, and for a moment she looked genuinely concerned. "Are you feeling okay? You look tired," I wanted to scream. Tired, I hadn't slept more than 5 hours in weeks. I just finished my final paper, coughing so hard I had to mute myself during Zoom office hours. But instead, I said, "I'm fine because old habits die hard." She offered to buy me medicine. I refused. She asked about school, and I told her I was doing well. She nodded like she was proud, like nothing had happened. Then right before we parted ways, she asked, "Are you still with that boy?" "That boy," I told her. "Yes, and I'm happy." She didn't say anything, just pursed her lips like she tasted something sour. Said she hoped I'd come to my senses soon, that the door was still open. If I wanted to talk, I walked out of Target, shaking. Not with sadness, but with clarity. They weren't waiting for me to succeed. They were waiting for me to fail. So they could say, "We told you so." That was the moment I stopped trying to earn their approval. That same week, I got my grades back. Dean's List. For the first time in my life, James spun me around in the kitchen when I told him, knocked over a chair and everything. Then he made me celebration toast with extra butter and a heart drawn in jelly. We were still broke, still tired, but we were okay, and more importantly, we were free. Healing doesn't always look like peace. Sometimes it looks like progress. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic sunrise or life-changing moment where everything clicked. Healing for me looked like paying the electric bill on time. It looked like a fridge with more than just condiments. It looked like James and I falling asleep without worrying about overdraft fees. It started with one piece of good news. James got offered a management position at the bookstore. The owner, this sweet, cranky old man named Leonard, had been running it for nearly 30 years and wanted to step back. He told James, "You're the only one who gives a damn about more than just alphabetizing." That was his version of a compliment. It came with a small pay raise, benefits, and most importantly, trust. James came home that night glowing, not in an ego kind of way. He just looked seen, validated. Around the same time, one of my freelance clients connected me with a small creative agency. They offered me a part-time role doing content writing. The pay wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. They said if I did well, they'd consider bringing me on full-time after graduation. For the first time in months, we exhaled. Not all the way, but enough. We finally started looking for a new apartment. Not because we hated the old place, though. Let's be real, that bathroom was cursed, but because we needed room to breathe, to grow. We found this tiny one-bedroom on the edge of town. It had old, creaky floors, a stove that needed coaxing to light, and windows that stuck in the summer. But it had a real kitchen, a closet, and this weird little alcove that we immediately turned into a reading nook with string lights and secondhand pillows. The day we signed the lease, James handed me the keys and said, "We built this," and I cried, right there on the steps, ugly, snotty, relieved crying. Because for the first time, I felt like we weren't just surviving, we were building something real. Graduation was coming. And with it, the question, do I invite my parents? They hadn't apologized. Not really. My dad called once and said something about reevaluating the situation, which is rich coming from someone who tried to buy my boyfriend's disappearance. My mom sent a few passive-aggressive texts, stuff like, "We'd love to celebrate your achievement if you're willing to be reasonable again." Reasonable. their favorite word for obedient, but in the end, I sent the invite. Not because I wanted them there, but because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of saying I shut them out. They showed up. Sat stiffly in the back row, didn't cheer, didn't smile, just watched. After the ceremony, I was taking photos with James and his mom, who has basically adopted me at this point, when they walked over. My mom went in for a hug. I flinched. Dad shook James's hand with the same energy he uses to sign tax forms. They said congratulations, and then made an excuse to leave before the group lunch. A week later, they invited me to coffee. I went because closure is tempting. They were polite, asked about the job, the apartment, my plans. Then my mom slid an envelope across the table. $5,000, a graduation gift. But her eyes told the truth. It wasn't a gift, it was bait. Dad leaned forward and said, "We're willing to support you again if you're willing to be sensible." There it was, the condition, the string. I slid the envelope back. Told them I was good without it. Told them I was done trading my freedom for comfort. Dad called me ungrateful. Mom said I was being cruel. I said I was being clear. When I left, I didn't cry, didn't rage. I just breathed. Because healing isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's sitting across from the people who broke you and realizing they no longer hold the power to decide your worth. James and I went out that night. Nothing fancy, just burgers and milkshakes at a diner down the street. We sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats and laughed over fries, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. Not because of him, but because I'd finally chosen me. They said he was a nobody. Funny, because that nobody helped me rebuild everything. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be buying a house with the guy my parents tried to bribe out of my life, I would have laughed in your face. But here we are, the paint's still peeling in the hallway. The kitchen floor makes this weird squeak every time you step near the fridge. There's a mysterious stain on the ceiling that we've both agreed to ignore until it becomes sentient. But it's ours, all of it. No help, no safety net, no strings. James bought the bookstore. The owner officially handed it over last month, and now there's a little wooden sign on the door that says James & Co. Even though the & Co. is mostly me helping with inventory and creating awkward seasonal window displays, it's still a grind. The store has good weeks and bad ones, but he's doing it, we're doing it, and I got promoted at the agency. Not to anything flashy, but enough to drop the cafe shifts and finally feel like I'm not one missed invoice away from disaster. We spend our weekends fixing things, scraping paint, assembling cheap furniture, learning painfully that YouTube tutorials make everything look easier than it is. But we also dance in the living room while the walls are still half painted. We eat cereal on the floor because we haven't found a dining table we like. We argue about grout colors. We fall asleep on the couch watching reruns of shows we've already seen 10 times. It's not glamorous. It's not from our circle, but it's real. Last week, I finally did something I'd been putting off for months. I called my parents on video, though warning. They answered visibly startled. My dad in his office, my mom still in workout clothes. I didn't waste time. I flipped the camera to show them the framed Dean's List certificate on the wall. Then the mortgage paperwork, our names side by side. Then James outside standing in front of the bookstore. Smiling sheepishly beneath the owner sign, I walked them through our tiny house, the half-finished living room, the tiny kitchen with mismatched mugs, the bedroom with books stacked in corners because we haven't built shelves yet, and then I looked them dead in the eye and said, "This is what that nobody helped me build in 1 year. No trust fund, no connections, no bribes." My dad tried to keep his expression neutral, but I saw it, the flicker of something that looked a lot like realization. He cleared his throat and said, "Looks modest, but I hope you're happy." Mom tried to soften the moment, said she missed me, apologized sort of for the dating profiles, but still called James that boy. I told them I wasn't interested in rehashing the past unless they were ready to acknowledge what really happened, and I meant it. We hung up, not with closure, but with boundaries, and for once that was enough. There are still hard days, bills burn out, moments where I wonder if I'll ever fully let go of the part of me that still wants my parents' approval. But there are also days like today where James and I are painting the living room while a thunderstorm rumbles outside, where his mom drops off cookies and reminds me that she's proud of me, even if your real mom's a bit behind on the emotional curve, where I look around and see a life I built, not one I inherited, and that feels like peace. If you were me, what would you have done? Would you have taken the money and walked away from love? Or would you have bet everything on someone who had nothing but honesty, kindness, and heart? Because they said he was a nobody, but he's the one who helped me become me.